she blows!
HBO's Watchmen hyped itself to high heaven, but to its credit, it didn't lie. There wasn't anything in any of the avalanche of interviews and promotional material to indicate HBO's Watchmen would ever be more than an attempt to retread a previously plowed but still lucrative field. One more go-around for a legendary thoroughbred with tired bones, a one-time thoroughbred originally created to perform one trick, just one very, very good trick. It's going to be trotted out again, and harnessed to a plow. HBO paid to slather that plow up in a new coat of paint for all those lovers of shiny new things. Then HBO asked you to pat them on the head for being bold. Ta-da! Wow! Whether you use the so-called Sagan standard, the idea that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, rephrase it as Flournoy's oft-repeated assertion, or default to Laplace, the idea remains the same. Come big or don't come at all. This is never a more valid standard than when it pertains to stenciling the Watchmen name over a Damon Lindelof production. Pastiche is doomed to direct comparison. You bring your A game, you don't ask your audience for the grace of excuses. You can't hitch your wagon to a well-known success and not expect critique of your remix. Remix was Damon Lindelof's key code word in his preemptively launched 5-page, outrageously passive-aggressive mea culpa on Instagram, and in his many promotional confiteors to obliging interviewers. Of course, all 5 pages of mixed signals and angst culminated in the blatantly tone-deaf marketing stunt of Lindelof telling Alan Moore to go fuck himself via an appeal to, of all things, punk rock. This guy. Coming all hard. This guy. Lindelof's attempt at manufactured controversy should have served as a headstone for this series. Damon Lindelof, lacing up an old pair of Brit-made docks, puffing himself up and staking his claim to art at the top of his lungs.
And I'll be coming for you, too.
Easy, showrunner. Robert Browning, in his poem Andrea del Sarto, may well have summed up what should be the impetus of all art, when he had the character make a bold statement and ask a stark question. It's often quoted, often misquoted, and almost universally accepted as a reaffirming ethos. Browning has Del Sarto utter these lines. Ah, but a man's reach should exceed his grasp, or what's a heaven for? We all believe that we agree with the sentiment, at least as it's usually expressed. Still, putting that stanza in context might serve HBO, Damon Lindelof, his oft-referenced writer's room, and, most pointedly, the casual fan. Browning's Andrea del Sarto concerns, in part, a painter attempting to convey something deeply personal to his beautiful, self-involved wife Lucretia. Del Sarto wants her to understand why his painting, though technically highly proficient and much lauded, is ultimately bereft of what constitutes art. To highlight his point, he uses the work of another artist by way of comparison. Does Lindelof's HBO Watchmen ever really live up to the idea of such a comparison? HBO's Watchmen uses the 1921 Tulsa riot as reason to enter for the Will Reeves character's ultimate adoption of the hooded justice persona, a loose general backdrop for the series, and the sole rationale for its Tulsa location. And all it ever takes us to is a white guy smugly declaring his plans for godhood in the best mustache-twirling tradition of snidely whiplashes everywhere. Because, he tells us, his guns were taken away. Yeehaw! What earth do these worldly and oh-so-diverse writers live on that is so trite that this sort of writing could pass muster? Conversely, does the show ever just try to entertain without diluting that moment with some pretentious nonsense? This show can't get out of its own way. It's so convoluted when it comes to its own themes, being neither a big story told little nor a little story told big. In the end, Lindelof's Watchmen shares too much in common with Browning's Andrea del Sarto. Just as Lucretia's beauty is bereft of genuine compassion and intellect to Del Sarto, her beauty only a surface gloss offering titillation, and sadly matching the spirit of Del Sarto's art, which is highly technical, but ultimately empty of soul, of earnest passion. So too Lindelof's Watchmen is dross, loaded with almost every conceivable literary pitfall, and utterly unacquainted with the concept of a light touch. Watchmen was insidious in the depth of the subterfuge in its deconstruction of long-standing comic archetypes, long before the term deconstruction earned its derision in the hands of lesser writers. In the end, that's where its real power lies, the earnestness and obvious love of the story about its protagonists, and the richness of the love of telling you that complex story. Where Moore and Gibbons relied on deftness, Lindelof wields a lead-weighted sap. Where Moore gave us moments of character development springing organically from within his story, and doesn't ever balk at the story's logical, ordained conclusion, Lindelof hedges his bets with a pandering nod at all the obvious totems of modern political correctness, and all without ever discovering a vibrantly beating heart in his creation. Even human prejudice is reduced to blatant recipe.
Please don't touch it.
What does this thing do?
It's complicated.
Try me.
It determines and exposes negative cultural biases to which the suspect might otherwise not admit.
So it's a racist detector.
They've mistaken diversity for complexity and generated all of their characters out of black puzzle pieces loosely interlocking with die-cut white puzzle pieces, without ever stopping to consider even the existence of the color gray, or a tacit recognition of the very concept of color bleed.
But they won't stay that way if just even a little bit of yolk gets mixed in with the whites. So that's why we gotta separate them.
There's no nuance, no verisimilitude. There's nothing genuine in any of these jigsaw characters to really latch onto, or to be grabbed by. All the characters do what they're commanded to. They mouth words with intensity, they dutifully perform actions, they show us angry faces, and they show us sad faces. But there's rarely any texture to them, no taste left on the tongue once they've faded off screen. It's all too filled with sage winks and self-conscious nods to ever let the characters truly live and breathe as human beings. They've got too much of an agenda to fill. On the other hand, the show never manages to embrace its origin in costumed hero comic books either, only paying it a sort of snide lip service. HBO's Watchmen never succeeds as a sophisticated, well-wrought drama, nor as a masked heroes genre set piece, and it certainly isn't a successful synthesis of the two, because it never has even a tenuous grasp on one or the other. HBO's Watchmen has all the hallmarks of a badly grafted burn victim. These people clearly wanted to be writing other things. What could have been an impactful story set in the real world and stemming from the events surrounding the Tulsa riot as a focal point ends up, as far as the plot of HBO's Watchmen is concerned, only serving as a thin veneer of social whitewash, an attempt to redirect the notion that a Watchmen sequel spearheaded by Damon Lindelof could ever be considered anything other than the most venal of cash grabs. Looking back, it should be clear to everyone just how thin that veneer really was from the very beginning.
The defense rests.
A genuine historical event with the real deaths of real people and real causes stemming from hundreds, if not thousands of years in the past and still reaching out 100 years later, used for little more than fodder in the attempt to weave a distracting cloak of cultural relevance, and being reduced to nothing but background noise for a story wherein the primary motivation for plot consequence is bad guys and bad girls, each wanting to steal the powers of a blue-skinned god of the atomic age so that they can take over the world. And not even an untainted hero to represent the legacy of the tragedy of that incident? No. Just a hand-me-down, race-swapped hooded justice is the best HBO can do to try to tie the Tulsa Riot storyline into the firmament of the original Watchmen comic. A problem with writing with an eye towards building from the ground up, without having to shuffle two disparate decks of two different sets of cards into one story and then slapping Watchmen on the title page, is that it wouldn't have garnered nearly as much attention. You wouldn't have watched it, though you might have tweeted about how insightful and relevant it was. The difficulty is that such a real-world setting would have required actual writing, sans the too easy sleight-of-hand diversions afforded by costume neurosis, mystery boxes, and the occasional blue dick. It would have meant starting from scratch, without the ready market niche afforded by stretching the whole thing, however poorly, over the borrowed framework of something called Watchmen, like a suit 2 sizes too large or 1 size too small, wrapped too tightly in some places while sagging in others, hung around a one-size-fits-all ready-made mannequin. As for the show being a meaningful or even marginally interesting comment on anything, intergenerational trauma, costumed heroes, cultural appropriation, determinism, voting rights for clones on unclaimed moons, or the best way to cook up calamari. No. It's quick, no-fuss entertainment for the cheap seats. It's weak sauce. For anyone who says, yeah, it was crap, but I liked it, hey, more power to you. I can actually see that. And if HBO's Watchmen was less pretentious in its press promotion of expectations, or had ever put in the hard work necessary to justify its own nonsense in-story, it might float at that level. But what in the world does that say about HBO's Watchmen? Even when all the caveats were granted, you still wouldn't be saying anything. Like a Shakespeare sonnet being mouthed by some cat holding a greeting card, or a carnival barker promising you all the sights you never wanted to see if you'll just pay your money and queue up like a good little target demographic. It's to laugh. HBO's Watchmen is a bigger Warner Brothers cartoon than the 4-color comic book from which it sought to draw its foundation was ever in danger of becoming. Rather than a bold insight into anything new, or an extrapolation of the creative approaches used in Watchmen, HBO makes of it merely a derivative, paint-by-number pastiche, with almost each plot point of the original Watchmen being rejiggered and then regurgitated in an almost haphazard fashion. Proficient only in its technical exercise, sterile in its attempt to broach anything remotely pertinent by way of social reflection or engaging action, and impotent in the reach of its own storyline. With an inevitable second season somewhere down the road, cash being king and Art's pink slip being for sale to the highest bidder, HBO's Watchmen remains and will continue to be what, at its core, it always was, from the moment of HBO announcing it. A paean to mediocrity in 9 parts. That once fine racing thoroughbred being asked to do something it was never meant to do. Pull a corporate IP plow, 30-plus years after winning the only race that mattered. If it weren't also hideously devoid of a shred of self-awareness on the part of Lindelof or his much-touted writer's room, it would be amusing. If the talk surrounding the show wasn't so barren of the least bit of critical discernment, and so frighteningly indicative of exactly where entertainment in this day and age has ended up, I might even have laughed out loud at the idea of Lindelof, of all people, making appeal to the notion of a punk rock sensibility. It's all just so unabashedly disconnected from reality. You get the irony, right? A story supposedly predicated on stolen history, synthesized memories liable to misuse, and righteous questions of social unrest and ingrained prejudice, being relegated to the reveal of something so easily dismissed as nothing but stock bad guys starting riots with subliminal message film projectors, sticky-fingered Vietnamese cleaning ladies, and 2 of the most uninspired arch villains to ever come out of central casting. It must drive Lindelof nuts to know that while he's simultaneously busy banking on the theory of the lowest common denominator to peddle this crap and offering mea culpas to anybody within earshot, Moore, as an artist, has refused consistently to either be bought off or to sell out. HBO's Watchmen, it courted a Jezebel media seemingly determined to banish itself from the table of legitimate critique with its constant croaking of irrational superlatives, and a subset of fans so desperately afraid that they'll miss out on being part of the next entertainment zeitgeist that they swallow it all down, ravenous with their eyes wide shut. But HBO's Watchmen, it never lied. It couldn't. It turned out to be just what you thought it was when it was first announced. And it never succeeded in being even one thing more. I know exactly what I say to that. It's the same thing Lindelof said to Moore, first in print and promo, and then said to us, the audience, in every frame of HBO's Watchmen.